Oh, I love those guys. That's Zusha singing their song, East Shtetl. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? We're one night away from Hanukkah. Let's light up the darkness. Who's going to be with us as we get it going on a fine Wednesday night? Pauline Michael, shalom from Arkansas, is first. Stephen Giger from New Hampshire, Sharon from New Jersey, John from Sedona, Melissa from Great Neck, Nancy from North Carolina. Bill says shalom. Sounds like tonight's episode will be highly applicable. Contact tracing in the Talmud, as we'll see. Renee Fott says, Indies in the house. Allison from Fayetteville. Michelle from Indiana. Sitara Nazneen Ahmed from Bel Air Bluffs in Florida. Welcome. Fred from Miami Beach. Angie from Columbus. Sue Strauss in the house from Chicago. Chaim Burke from Charlotte. Hunting is in the air. Tom Beck, shalom from Pennsylvania. John Wheeler. Man, these are interesting city names. From Puyallup? I'd like to know how to pronounce that. Puyallup, Washington. Donna Smith from Bahama, North Carolina. Peter from Livingston. Mark from Oregon. Excuse me. My lips are very dry. It's very dry here in LA. Gloria from Texas. Jason. Latkes are coming up. Latkes and sufganiyot. This is when we can go to a kosher Krispy Kreme and eat donuts because we're commanded to. Where am I? Paula from Chicago. Yehudit from Florence, South Carolina. Sandy says good evening. Charles with us from San Antonio. Nicholas from Portland. Lucinda. Hey y'all from Little Rock. John in Texas. James says shalom. And Hamza, I'm not quite understanding what you're saying there. Okay, and then over on the YouTube side, Neil is with us from Virginia. Yes. And Neil is one of our dedications tonight. Thank you so much, Neil. We are in the midst of our annual campaign, raising our budget for the coming year. If you appreciate the work that we do, this is the time to partner with us in bringing Torah to the world. When you donate to our nonprofit, it has massive impact. So many people are able to learn, even many who would not otherwise be learning at all, except that they bumped into us online and now they are learning. So donations to our nonprofit have massive impact and a massive merit to you in both this world and the next. Nina will put that link in the comments, but it's so simple. Donate.accidentaltalmudist.org. Neil dedicating tonight's AT Daily in honor of my wife, Cindy, who runs the social action projects at our temple and constantly inspires me to live the Torah that I learn. You are a role model for our whole family, Cindy, and we love you. What a beautiful dedication to your wife, Cindy. Well done, Yasher Koach, Neil, and may you merit to do many more mitzvahs in your life, to learn many more pages, to give to many more good causes in the merit of the gift that you've given tonight. And we say amen. Marilyn Moore, dedicating our episode in honor of my son Russell's 50th birthday. Yom Huledet Sameach to Russell, a beautiful dedication from your mom, Marilyn. And Marilyn, may you enjoy learning Torah to 120. And we say amen. And also, Allison Wolgamuth is dedicating our episode in memory of Billy Rector. May Billy Rector's memory always be for a blessing. May his neshama, his soul, have a great aliyah, a great elevation in the world of souls. And we say amen. Okay. All right. We've definitely got a challenging daf before us, and it's a great opportunity. So where are we? We're in Pesachim, the fourth volume of the Talmud. These are the laws of Passover. We're in chapter 1, discussing the fifth Mishnah. We've been on it for a few days. This is Daf Yodches, page 18 of Tractate Pesachim. Now, so we've been having a lot of these kind of technical laws. This question has been asked, and we've been discussing it for a while. Do liquids have the ability to receive tumah, ritual impurity, and to transmit tumah, ritual impurity? Can they receive it according to Torah law? Certainly they can receive tumah according to rabbinic law. The sages have been debating whether they could do it according to Torah law, and if they can receive it, can they transmit it? And if they can transmit it, can they transmit it to foods, to liquids, and to vessels? So this is the kind of the wrinkles of the question that we are encountering. And in the midst of today's daf, the sages refer to the source for this in the Torah, which is at Leviticus 11:34. But what's interesting is, they're just citing a few words from that verse. Here in the Koren Talmud, elucidated by Rav Steinsaltz, they're going to cite the whole verse. But actually, as I read this verse, this is really confusing and difficult stuff. So tonight, we're going to do something a little bit different. First of all, we're going to read that verse in its context in the Torah. It's not enough just to read a few words of the verse or even the whole verse. So often, when we encounter a verse of the Torah that the sages are using as a source of law, and then they're going to derive, whether they're going to argue whether they should issue a rabbinic decree to make a fence around that verse of the Torah so that we don't come to inadvertently violate that law. They're going to debate what the law actually is, where it applies. And this is where we get these kind of discussions. Is this thing prohibited by Torah law, or is it prohibited by the rabbinic decree that the rabbis made around the Torah law? That should be clear, but it isn't always clear. But when we're discussing that kind of a situation, a law based in a verse of the Torah, even though only the verse is given on our page of Talmud, it can be so productive, so fruitful, so right? So fruitful to go back to the Torah and read the other verses around it so that we get where we're coming from. It'll make it so much easier to understand where we're going to. So we're going to read these verses in the Torah. That's going to help us understand what's going on as God is, teaching the Jewish people through his prophet Moses. What is ritual impurity? What is tumah? What is it that you're going to need to avoid in order to keep my holy things in a state of purity, and even non-holy things, but that need to be in a state of purity? For example, a person isn't by definition holy, but he needs to be in a state of purity in order to enter the temple compound when the temple is standing in Jerusalem. An offering that is going to go up on the altar, that is a holy thing. It is consecrated, it is set aside, it is made holy. It's pretty amazing when we think that God gives us the power to consecrate, right? To make something holy. By saying, I'm setting aside this animal, it's going to be offered up on the altar, it's going to be a sacrifice, or this amount of flour, or this amount of wine, or even I'm going to set this aside to give it to the priest so that he can eat it. That too is consecrated, and then it's going to have additional stringencies associated with it. But certainly one of those stringencies is that it has to be in a state of ritual purity. It cannot have come into contact with impurity and be eaten by the priest or be offered up on the altar. So these laws are coming down from God to Moses transmitting to the people by way of the written Torah here. So let's read these verses. This is Leviticus 11:34 is the verse that the sages are arguing about on our page in the Talmud. But we're going to go back and read Leviticus 11:29 through 34. That's going to give us a much clearer understanding of what's going on here in the Torah. Then, before we go back to the Talmud, we're going to read what Rashi has to say, right? So, in many ways, Rashi I don't know about greatest, certainly top 5, maybe greatest, but in many ways the most important commentator on the Torah, in some senses in history. Because Rashi did a commentary on all of the Bible and on all of the Talmud. And what he was going after was to make it as clear as possible according to the way that the sages have understood it over the thousands of years that we've been looking at these verses of the Torah and then looking at the discussions in the Talmud. Rashi is always trying to make it as clear as possible for us. Now, he's writing about 1,000 years ago in, pre-medieval France. So, his sensibilities are not our sensibilities, but it's astonishing what a great job Rashi did in making things clear. So we're going to read the verses in the Torah, then we're going to read what Rashi has to say about it, then we're going to discuss what a kal vachomer is. It's one of the hermeneutical principles that the sages are going to use to derive a principle on our page of the Talmud. And then we're going to go and we're going to read a part of this, not this whole page, but a section of it just as it is. Usually I break down the ideas and sort of teach what's there without, I read the Mishnas to you, but then I, pick and choose which parts of the Gemara we're going to study and go in depth. But today, we're going to set the stage by reading the verses of the Torah and then reading the Rashi, explaining what the kal vachomer principle is for drawing out a principle of the law, and then we're going to read the discussion of the sages in the Talmud. So let's go on this journey together. Okay, the verses. We're going to start at Leviticus 11:29. So says God to Moses, and Moses is writing it down and telling us, "These are for you the impure among the creeping animals that creep upon the ground." Right? So when we talk about a sheretz, this is a creeping thing, and that when it is dead, and we're going to see why it matters that it is dead, it is a source of tumah. Right, an av hatumah, a source of ritual impurity, that if we come into contact with it, or if certain foods and objects come into contact with it, it's going to start that chain of transmission, right? Tonight's title is Contact Tracing in the Talmud, right? So we're going to have a chain of transmission of tumah, ritual impurity. So the main place it could start is a human dead body. But right now we're talking about a sheretz, a creeping thing. Well, what is a sheretz? These are for you, the impure among the creeping animals that creep upon the ground. Now, of course, I'm going to be reading it to you from the Art Scroll. This is the Art Scroll. This is the book of Leviticus with the commentary of Rashi. And the Art Scroll, it's very traditional in certain ways. And so here, because it's a little unclear exactly which are these insects, it's not going to translate. It's going to stay in Hebrew because there's argument about exactly what are these animals. So the first is the choled, right? So the choled is one of the creeping things, and then the achbar and the tzav according to its kind. Now Rashi tells us that the tzav is similar to a frog, not a frog, similar to a frog, and the anach and the koach and the leta'ah and the chomet and the tinshemis. And then Rashi will translate these things into Old French, a hérisson, a lézard, a limace, and a talpe. And then, just because we have some notes here from Art Scroll, right? I'm not going to get too much into the particular animals because it doesn't matter that much for our purposes tonight. But it's maybe lizards and snails and slugs and a particular type of snail, a particular kind of insect. Here it says that it could be a hedgehog or a porcupine, but it's not a hedgehog or a porcupine. At any rate, there's these creeping things that are listed. I think maybe a mouse is one of them. I'm not doing that list now. For our purposes tonight, there's 8 creeping things that when they're dead, they impart a very strong form of tumah, of ritual impurity. Okay, now only these are impure to you, this is the Torah now, only these are impure to you among all the creeping animals. Anyone who touches them when they are dead, so when they're alive, they don't impart impurity. And other animals don't impart impurity, right? Except like a kosher animal that was not slaughtered properly, that's a nevela, that does, right? So we're not going to go into all the distinctions of animals that do and do not impart tumah, but in these verses, these are the creeping things, and that when they are dead and you touch them, they're going to impart impurity. But not just if you touch them, there's other additional rules about these when you have the carcass of a creeping thing. So, anyone who touches them when they are dead shall be impure until evening, right? So this is where we get the source of the law, that if you touch a sheretz, if you become impure through touching a dead sheretz, you're going to have to immerse in a mikvah and to become purified. And then you have to wait until the sun sets for your purification process to end. We get that here. Shall be impure until evening. And when they are dead, anything upon which part of them will fall shall become impure, whether it is a wooden utensil, a garment, leather, or sackcloth. Any utensil with which work is done shall be brought into water and remain impure until the evening, and it becomes cleansed. Any earthenware utensil into whose interior one of them will fall, everything in it shall become impure, and you shall break it. Right? So eventually there's going to be a huge argument, dramatic and emotional, when it's Rabbi Eliezer versus the other sages, about the oven of Achnai, which is sort of like a new technology, where ovens in those days was a big earthenware made out of clay, like this kind of large inverted pot with a fire inside it, and that's where you bake your bread, right? So if a sheretz falls into that, so then the whole thing becomes impure, and you cannot purify earthenware. Right? Like the way that you can with metal and with wood. If it becomes impure, it can be purified. But earthenware cannot. You need to break it. But then this oven of Achnai, it's not one large earthenware oven. It was made out of rings separated by some kind of sand or mortar. And so, Rabbi Eliezer ruled, this is not an earthenware oven. It's something made out of different rings of earthenware mortared together. So now if a sheretz goes inside it, you don't have to break it, right? And that was very good for people who didn't have a lot of money, because previously if sheretz goes in, okay, you need a new oven. That's it. It can't be fixed. It's just a creeping thing got in there. Now you need a new oven. Very difficult on the poor. And so Rabbi Eliezer came up with a way to justify you wouldn't have to break those things. But the other sages disagreed with him. And that disagreement had huge and emotional consequences. That's for another day. Okay. Right, so an earthenware utensil into whose interior one of them shall fall because it's dead, right? If it just crawls inside and crawls out, it's not the issue. But if it's dead inside there, everything in it shall become impure. That's part of the discussion we're going to have today. And you shall break it. Of any food, now we're in verse 34, of any food that is edible, upon which water comes, shall become impure. Now that right there is a source of a huge amount of law in the Talmud, that, some kind of a grain, for example, you've harvested your wheat, and now you've got it piled up there, and it's dry wheat, right? It's just been, you separated it from the chaff, etc. You've piled it up. You've tithed it, let's say, set aside some for the priest, some for the Levite, some for yourself to sell or take with you to go up to Jerusalem for the pilgrimage. Those are the tithes. And now it's sitting there. But let's say that what you set aside for the priest, that's the teruma, that's consecrated because it's for the use of a priest only. And that has to be in a state of impurity. Now, let's say that a dead, creeping thing falls on that pile of grain that's set aside for the priest, the teruma. has this now become invalidated. It's no longer holy. It's no good for the priest to eat because it's not in a state of purity anymore. Here we learn if it's just dry grain and the insect touches it, it does not become impure because it hasn't been prepared for impurity. It hasn't been made susceptible to impurity. How does it become susceptible? It first has to come into contact with water. And then we'll learn out, the sages will learn out that not only water, but anything that is called a liquid, and there are 7 sort of defined liquids. They're going to be, off the top of my head, I think it's like water, honey, blood, milk, oil, wine. There's 7 of them. Okay, so if any food that is edible, upon which water comes, shall become impure, and any liquid that can be drunk in any vessel shall become impure. Now, this shall become impure that's repeated in verse 34 is also going to be a subject for interpretation according to the discussion on our page. But before we go back to the Talmud, now let's see what Rashi says about the verses that we've just read. So Rashi says, we have learned from here many things. First, we have learned that food does not become ready and prepared, i.e. does not become susceptible to receive tumah, impurity, until water will have come upon it at some time. And once water has come upon it, even only one time, it receives, i.e. is susceptible to impurity forever, even if it is presently dry, right? So in order to be susceptible to tumah, grain has to have come into contact with water or one of the other 6 liquids. But once it has come into contact with those liquids, even though it dries and the liquid evaporates and is gone, it remains susceptible to tumah. And, says Rashi, we have learned the second rule, that the wine and the oil and anything called a liquid, and here they are, the 7 liquids are dew, water. So dew and water are separate. That's why I always have trouble remembering. Dew and water are 2 of them. Wine, oil, blood, milk, and honey. Those are the 7 liquids that render food susceptible to tumah. Until they've touched some liquid, they cannot become ritually impure, tameh. Okay, so we have learned that wine and the oil and anything called a liquid prepares seed, i.e. renders seeds, that's a food, susceptible to impurity, as does water. For the verse can be expounded as follows, upon which water comes, or any liquid that can be drunk in any vessel, will make the food susceptible to becoming impure. Water or any liquid that comes in a vessel. Rashi continues, and our rabbis also learned a third thing from here, that an offspring of impurity, right? So a source of impurity is an av hatumah, like the sherets. The creeping thing is a source of impurity. And then let's say, a vessel touches the sherets. Now it's a rishon, first degree derived impurity, or a child of impurity, right? Because its impurity came from a source of impurity. So the rabbis also learn that an offspring of impurity, i.e. that which received its impurity from a primary source, does not transmit impurity to implements, right? So a vessel that touched the sherets, it becomes impure. But the vessel, now that is a rishon with first degree derived impurity, if it touches another vessel, it will not transmit its impurity to the next vessel. The chain of transmission is fragile here. The impurity won't go from sherets to vessel to vessel. For we have learned as follows. One might be able to think that all implements should become impure from being inside the interior space of an impure earthenware vessel. To teach us otherwise, the Torah says, everything in it shall become impure of any food. From this we see food and drink become impure when they are in the interior space of an impure earthenware vessel, but all implements do not become impure from the interior space of an earthenware vessel, right? So the Torah tells us, like, so you've got this clay pot, and there's some food in the pot, and there's a utensil in the pot, and the food and the utensil are not touching each other, and then the sheretz falls in, so the food in the pot is going to become tameh, but the fork in the pot is not going to become tameh. Why? Because food and drink become impure from the interior space of an impure earthenware vessel, but all implements do not become impure from the interior space of an earthenware vessel. Because the carcass of the creeping animal is the father of impurity, the source of impurity, and the earthenware vessel, which became impure through it, is an offspring of impurity, right? So the sheretz falls into the earthenware vessel, the clay pot. The sheretz is the source of tumah. The clay pot that it fell into is now a rishon, right? It's derived tumah, first degree derived tumah from the sheretz that fell into it. Where am I? Hold on. Yes. Because the creeping animal that fell in is the father of impurity, and the earthenware vessel itself, which became impure through it, is an offspring of impurity. So it has a lesser degree of impurity, and therefore it cannot in turn defile vessels that are inside it. So not just a fork, but let's say that there's like a metal goblet, right? Like an old-fashioned, right? You can imagine the movies, Robin Hood movies, they have like a goblet made out of metal. So in this big clay pot, there's the metal goblet, and there's some food, and the sheretz falls in, doesn't touch the metal goblet. The food is going to become impure from sharing airspace inside that from the airspace inside the earthenware vessel, but the goblet is not, right? And we have also learned a fourth thing, that in the case of a creeping animal whose carcass falls into an earthenware oven's interior space, and bread is inside the oven, and the creeping animal did not touch the bread, and the oven is an offspring of impurity of the first degree, right? The oven itself is a rishon. It's deriving its impurity from the sheretz, the creeping thing, the dead creeping thing that fell into it. And the bread is an offspring of impurity of the second degree. The bread is a sheni. The bread didn't touch the sheretz. It's receiving its impurity from the earthenware oven. But we do not say that we view the oven as if it were full of impurity, and that the bread should be an offspring of the first degree. For if you say this, all implements have not been excluded from becoming impure from the interior space of an earthenware vessel, for a primary source of impurity itself has touched them on their outer surface. Right? So we don't say that all the air inside that earthenware oven is filled with impurity, because then that metal goblet should have become impure, and it doesn't. Somehow, being inside an earthenware vessel that becomes tameh from the sheretz that fell inside, will transmit tumah to food that's in the earthenware vessel, but not to vessels that are inside the earthenware vessel. For if you say this, all implements have not been excluded. Yeah, I said that. Has touched their outer surface. And we have learned, and that's it. So that's what I wanted to share from Rashi. So don't worry if you didn't memorize all of that, even understand all of that. But we're just starting to get at this idea that from these verses, right, the Torah said, it was pretty clear that seed cannot become impure unless water falls on it first. It was pretty clear that a sheretz that falls on food will cause it to become tameh if it's been prepared by coming to contact with moisture. It was pretty clear that if a sheretz fell into an earthenware vessel, that vessel is going to become impure. It's not going to be capable of becoming purified. It's going to have to be destroyed. Any food that was inside it is going to become tameh. But a vessel that was inside the earthenware vessel, like a metal vessel inside the earthenware vessel, will not become impure. That was derived by the rabbis. That was not clear from the Torah's overt expression of it. All right. Now we come to the discussion in the Talmud on our page, right? So, I'm sorry. And the one other thing I wanted to share is a lot of the discussion tonight is going to depend on a kal vachomer, which is usually translated as a fortiori sequence, right? Meaning from something that is strong to something that is weak. Kal vachomer means minor and major. And so thanks to Rabbi Elliot Goldberg, who provides the following example to help us understand this principle. What is a kal vachomer? It's where we're going to extend a principle from a major place to a minor place in a direction that makes sense, or vice versa. What does that mean? It's a little too general to understand. So the example helps a lot. Let's say that in a particular jurisdiction, the punishment for manslaughter, somebody who is guilty of manslaughter, right? So it's somebody who kills somebody else. It's a homicide, but he did that without previous, intention. He didn't plan to do it. It happened in the heat of the moment. I think that's a pretty good definition of manslaughter. So the punishment for that is 10 years, right? So if the punishment for manslaughter is 10 years in prison, then we know that for murder, which is a more serious crime than manslaughter, and usually because there was previous planning involved or lying in wait or whatever. I was a lawyer once, but that was 30 years ago. I'm no expert in common law. But we all agree that murder is more serious than manslaughter. So if the penalty for manslaughter is 10 years, kal vachomer, a fortiori, the penalty for murder has to be no less than 10 years, right? It has to be more than 10 years, but certainly no less than 10 years. Since we know what the penalty is for manslaughter, we know that murder is worse than manslaughter, so we can assume that the penalty for murder ought to be worse than 10 years, ought to be more years in prison than 10 years, and certainly not less. And this can go in the other direction. If, for example, in a particular jurisdiction, for a kind of murder, let's say second-degree murder, the penalty, the death penalty does not apply. Right? So in some states, first-degree murder, I think, is when you murder a police officer. Second-degree murder is, when you murder anyone else. And maybe in some jurisdiction, first-degree murder makes you susceptible. It's possible to be sentenced to the death penalty, but second-degree is not. Right? So in this particular jurisdiction we're talking about, second-degree murder is not. You cannot get the death penalty for that. Well, we know that second-degree murder is worse than manslaughter. So if you can't get the death penalty for committing second-degree murder, for sure you can't get the death penalty for committing manslaughter. That's a kal vachomer. That's going from major to minor or from minor to major. Another principle that we'll see here in our discussion is dayo, meaning it is sufficient. Same root as dayenu, the song that we sing at Passover. And what it means there is, well, you can't keep, because when we're making a kal vachomer, when the sages are making a kal vachomer based on laws in the Torah, what they're going to say is, well, we know that this transgression has this penalty. If we're talking, it doesn't always have to be with transgressions and penalties, but let's just say that the Torah specifies that a particular transgression has a particular penalty. So like a less severe transgression is going to have no worse a penalty and probably less of a penalty, but certainly no worse a penalty than the law that's specified in the Torah. But then you could say, for example, second degree murder, you can't get the death penalty. Therefore, manslaughter, for sure, you can't get the death penalty. And a parking ticket, for sure, you can't get the death penalty. And for sure, it must have a smaller penalty than for manslaughter. Now, that would make sense. What you can say is that a parking ticket, based on this verse, the verse in question, is not going to have a death penalty, right? Because just like a parking ticket is not as bad as second-degree murder, and second-degree murder, you can't get a death penalty. So a parking ticket, you can't get the death penalty. But if all we have is that one source, right? If that was a verse in the Torah, that second-degree murder, no death penalty, then we could not learn out that, okay, and manslaughter has to be something less than the death penalty, and the parking ticket has to be something less than manslaughter. We might be able to derive that somewhere else, but what we're not going to do is keep basing, having established a law, we see a law is a verse in the Torah, and then we establish a rabbinic law based on a kal vachomer, that something has to be no less than that or no more than that based on a logical inference. But then we don't establish that as the baseline law and then create another kal vachomer on the kal vachomer. We don't multiply rabbinic decrees like that. You can base one rabbinic decree on a law in the Torah, but then you don't base another rabbinic decree on the first rabbinic decree. That they don't do, lest the rabbis start multiplying laws like crazy, right? There's enough laws in the Talmud when we only sort of derive one degree of law removing from the Torah. If they were deriving laws from derived laws, there would be no end. And that's the principle of Dayo. Okay, so now let's read this discussion. We're just going to do a section of today's daf. Let's see if we can follow it, and then I'll open it for comments and questions. So remember that the verse that we're talking about now, we read it in context, but the verse that they're discussing is Leviticus 11:34. From all food which may be eaten, upon which water has come, shall be impure, and all drink that may be drunk in every vessel shall be impure. So that's the verse, and now the rabbis are going to use that verse to try to understand, well, exactly how does the tumah, the ritual impurity, attach to liquids, and to what extent can liquids that have become tameh transmit that tumah to other things, whether it be other foods, other liquids, or vessels. Because they're going to say that they're going to argue about it, but there's going to be different transmissibility, as it were, of liquids to other things. So the Gemara asks, and say that the term that liquid transmits, say that the term teaches that liquid transmits tumah, ritual impurity, to vessels. Let's say that this verse is coming to teach us that a liquid can transmit its impurity to vessels. And the Gemara rejects this contention. Isn't it a kal vachomer and a fortiori inference? And how do we get that? Just as an impure vessel, right? So a vessel that has become impure, how did it become impure? From the sherets, right? So sherets can render a vessel impure. Then what can the vessel do? Just as an impure vessel, which transmits impurity to liquid that comes into contact with it. Okay, so a sheretz falls into a vessel, and there's liquid in the vessel. We saw if there's food or liquid in the vessel, the sheretz falls into the vessel. It doesn't even touch the food or liquid, but it's in the air, it's inside the vessel, and now the vessel can transmit that tumah to the liquid. So now we have a chain of transmission, sheretz to vessel to liquid in the vessel. So just as an impure vessel which transmits impurity to the liquid that it comes into contact with it, nevertheless does not transmit impurity to another vessel. So a vessel that became impure does not transmit its impurity to another vessel. That was the goblet inside the earthenware oven. So it does not transmit from vessel to vessel, only vessel to food. So, says the kal vachomer, if it can go sheretz to vessel to liquid, but the vessel can't transmit its tumah to another vessel, then surely the tumah that went from the sheretz to the vessel to the liquid, now from a liquid cannot pass to another vessel. Since it cannot go sheretz, vessel, vessel, the rabbis are arguing, therefore it cannot, the tumah, the impurity cannot go sheretz, vessel, liquid, vessel, right? Because there's one more stop in that chain of transmission. If it can't go sheretz, vessel, vessel, certainly it can't go sheretz, vessel, liquid, vessel. right? Because it should be, it's diminished each time. Each time something goes, tumah goes from one object to another, it's lessened in its degree of severity. It becomes weaker and weaker. So how could it possibly go sheretz vessel if it can't go sheretz vessel liquid vessel? That's the kal vachomer. Right, so just as an impure vessel, which transmits impurity to liquid that comes into contact with it, nevertheless does not transmit impurity to another vessel, so too, liquids that come to a state of impurity due to contact with a vessel, is it not right that they should not transmit their impurity to vessels? What we just said. The Gemara suggests, and say that when liquids do not transmit ritual impurity to a vessel, that is only in the case of liquids that come to a state of impurity due to contact with an impure vessel, as the vessel itself does not transmit impurity to another vessel. However, with regard to liquids that come to a state of impurity due to contact with a creeping animal, a more severe form of impurity indeed, they should transmit impurity to vessels. So now the Gemara is asking, okay, we know that the impurity cannot go sheretz, vessel, can't go to the second vessel. And we know that it cannot go sheretz, vessel, liquid vessel. But, ask the Gemara, well, what if it goes sheretz, liquid? Can that liquid now transmit its tumah to a vessel? Right? We know that the liquid can't transmit to a vessel when it received its tumah from a vessel that received its tumah from a sheretz. But what if the liquid received its tumah directly from a sheretz? In that situation, can the liquid transmit the tumah to a vessel? That's the question. And the Gemara rejects this contention. Are liquids that come to a state of impurity due to contact with a creeping animal stated explicitly in the Torah? The impure liquids mentioned in the verse become impure by contact with a vessel that came into contact with a creeping animal. So now the Gemara is saying, well, we don't know. We don't know what the situation is. We haven't come to that part of our analysis. We know that if it goes sheretz vessel, it can't go to the next vessel. And we know that if it goes sheretz vessel liquid, it can't then go to a vessel. But we don't know if it goes sheretz liquid, can it go to a vessel? We don't know. We haven't derived that yet. So the Gemara asks, and doesn't the tumah of liquids, the impurity of liquids that come into contact with a creeping animal, come from a kal vachomer sequence, right? So now it's saying, well, wait a minute, why don't we know? Why can't we derive that? Just as liquids that come to be tameh, come to a state of impurity due to contact with a vessel, which itself became impure due to contact with a creeping animal, they transmit impurity with regards to, therefore, with regards to liquid that come to a state of impurity due to contact with a creeping animal, all the more so is it not clear that they transmit impurity to a vessel. Let's repeat that. Just as liquids that come to a state of impurity from contact with a vessel, which itself became impure, right? So if it goes sheretz vessel liquid, and the liquid got its impurity from the vessel, and the vessel got its impurity from the sheretz, then all the more, if the sheretz touches the liquid directly, it should receive that impurity. We don't know if it can then transmit it, but all the more it should receive the impurity by coming into contact with the vessel, with the sheretz itself. But what the answer we're looking for is, if it goes sheretz liquid, can it therefore transmit its impurity to the vessel? And here's that principle of Dayo. The Gemara answers, since the basic halacha, the law of these liquids, is derived by means of a kal vachomer, an a fortiori sequence, inference, no stringencies are added to it. In accordance with the principle, it is sufficient, Dayo, for the conclusion that emerged from the a fortiori, maybe Dayo is a better pronunciation. It is sufficient, Dayo, for the conclusion that emerged from the kal vachomer to be like the source of the kal vachomer. In other words, a halacha derived by means of a kal vachomer is no more stringent than the source from which it is derived. In this case, the liquid that became impure through contact with the creeping animal transmits impurity to the same extent that liquid that became impure through contact with a vessel does. We're not going to be able to make a kal vachomer on a kal vachomer. And that's why, even though logically it sounds like if we know that the tumah can pass sheretz vessel liquid, and then it can't go to another vessel, but if it goes sheretz directly to the liquid, maybe it can transmit to a vessel. We just can't learn that out because we don't have the basis for that. The Gemara asks, you know what? I think that's enough. We're going to stop there because we're running out of time. I'm sure there's going to be some questions on this, and it's hard material. But you see, I just wanted to get into exactly how they argue and how they're trying to piece it out. You know, at the end of the day, what they're going to say, now there's going to be a new sequence by Rabbi Akiva, and it's going to show, well, liquid can transmit its tumah to food, but it cannot transmit to a vessel. So what about food? Food can transmit to food? No. Can food transmit to a vessel? No. Can food transmit its tumah to liquid? Yes. We don't have to go through each step of their derivations, but now we see how they start with a verse, how they learn everything that's possible to learn from that verse, how they start to make sequential logical inferences. You know, if A is bigger than C, A is bigger than B, and B is bigger than C, A must be bigger than C. It's that sort of that type of logical reasoning, but it's more steps in the process. And so if you could follow it tonight, and this one might even be worth listening to again, another reason to cut it off a little early, then you can follow how the rabbis make this hermeneutical exegesis from the law that's printed in the written Torah. All right, that's what I've got for us for right now. Let us look at comments and questions. Okay. This has been tough stuff. Okay, so I have one question. Deriving rabbinic laws from rabbinic laws is different than making a fence around the Torah? Exactly. Because making a fence around the Torah means that the rabbis issue a decree around a law that's in the Torah, because the one thing we for sure don't want to do is violate a law written in the Torah. That's considered a more severe transgression than the fence, right? Than the rabbinic decrees that are trying to protect us from that. So what they would not do is there's a law in the Torah, and then they make a rabbinic decree that just protects us from coming to violate the law in the Torah, and then make a law on top of that, right? So, for example, when we started our journey through Tractate Shabbos, what's written in the Torah? You cannot kindle a flame on Shabbos, right? So you're going to have to make a light before Shabbos begins. That's where the tradition comes from, right? For women to light candles before Shabbos begins. So there'll be light in the house because you can't kindle that light later. Okay, then it also, we learned out, I think it actually says it in the Torah, or we learn it out from it. I'm not even sure, but for sure, you cannot kindle a light and you cannot extinguish a light. And I think extinguishing a light is considered a Torah prohibition, not a rabbinic prohibition. But the rabbinic prohibition is you can't move the light on Shabbos, right? Once you've lit this is a wisdom candle, this is not a Shabbos light, right? But if it was a Shabbos light, you would light it before Shabbos and then you don't touch it, right? Why? Because if you moved it, especially if it was an oil lamp, you might cause that oil to slosh around. Some oil might fall out. The wick might become immersed and might be put out. And so the rabbis are protecting you from coming to extinguish a light, which would be a Torah violation, by further decreeing that you can't move the light. That's the rabbinic decree. Now we have a law that you can't move the light, but that's a rabbinic decree. If they were then to issue another law that because they wanted to protect you not from extinguishing the light, but from coming to move the light. So let's say that they made another law and it said, I don't know, they didn't do this, right? But if they said, you know, that a candlestick can't have a handle on it, because then you might come to move it. They didn't make that. I'm making that up. But the reason they wouldn't do that is because putting the handle on it would protect you from coming to move the light. And moving the light is not a Torah law or a Torah prohibition. Moving the light is a rabbinic prohibition, so that you don't come to extinguish the light, right? So they don't make rabbinic decrees on rabbinic decrees. They don't make rabbinic decrees to protect us from violating rabbinic decrees. They only make rabbinic decrees to protect us from violating Torah laws. Hold on a second. Okay, question is, what lessons can we learn from degrees of impurity? A vessel that touched a sheretz is impure, but the vessel doesn't transmit. It transmits to food, but then the food doesn't transmit to another vessel, right? So there's this idea that impurity is lessened as you go down this chain of transmission. And the question is sort of on a spiritual level, what might we learn from that? I don't have a good, ready answer for that. But it's a really good question. If we think about this for a second, because we were talking about yesterday that holiness does not beget holiness, in the sense that if something holy touches something holy, it doesn't make the other thing holy. The way we spread holiness is through knowledge and awareness, right? So that we can, when we teach people how they can consecrate something, how they can bring holiness into their lives, that's how holiness spreads. Impurity does transmit impurity through contact, but it's interesting that there's a limit to it, right? There's a limit to it, that the impurity is lessened, right? So, I think really what we can learn out from that is the incredible value of distancing ourselves from sin, right? And like, for example, if you know that you're a person that can't be trusted, right? Like you're addicted to shopping, and you think that, wasting money, wasting one's hard-earned money, like on, just buying stuff that you don't need, and you're going to do that you're particularly susceptible to that. So then you have to just sort of decree upon yourself that, then you're not going to spend time on Amazon, without safeguards in place. Or much worse kinds of sin, right? Like if you distance yourself from it, this is actually encouraging. This is actually inspiring, right? Like if you distance yourself from it a little bit, just a little bit, its pull on you is going to be severely lessened, right? So that's why, we want to stay away from people that pull us into sin. Like just opening up even a little distance between us and them. I know people who are in 12-step programs, very often they have to make new friends, right? Because the friends that they were hanging out with before were the ones that they were engaging in the addictive behaviors with. So, and it's tough for them. Like, these are people that they've really been around a long time. And am I really going to just reject that person, for good and not be there for them? Maybe they could get into the 12-step program, etc. But a person who's an addict knows that he's in danger. But knowing that if you open up that a bit of distance, there's so much power in that, because now that, that impurity, that sin, that transgression can't jump it can't bridge that distance as long as you open it. So putting these safeguards in place, like, you're not going to be around people who dragged you into that addictive behavior unless it's in a public place or with your sponsor or, whatever safeguards you're going to put into place. Then you can know that there's, you're always going to be at risk. You're always going to be susceptible, but there's tremendous power in organizing yourself. In other words, you can surmount the obstacle. We have God gives us the strength. We may not have it readily, but if we organize ourselves and open that little bit of distance between us and the source of impurity, then the impurity becomes much weaker and we'll be able to conquer it. All right, that's what I've got for us today. Challenging daf, but we sort of broke it down piece by piece, went to the original source, didn't read just the verse in the Torah that the discussion was based on in the Talmud, but read the surrounding verses, read what Rashi had to say about it, studied a little bit what the principle is that's in use on our page, and then went back to the material, and then it made much more sense than the first time that we read it. And obviously that's a good way to approach tough passages in the Talmud and in life. That's what I've got for us tonight. Have a great evening. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow for page 19 of Tractate Pesachim on the first night of Hanukkah.